How's it going, YouTube? My name is Tim McDonald, and been super excited to kick things off with you guys. And I figured I'd jump on the YouTube train and start doing some fishing videos, so I could start recording some of the cool places I get to go, and some of the neat fish that I get to catch, and some of the cool sights that I get to do too, get to see as well. You know, that is one thing that I have always loved about fishing, is getting out and seeing the beautiful sights. And of course, you know, we're always out there to land that big one and be able to brag to our friends and things like that. But I'm not doing this to go viral or nothing, I'll be honest with you. I'm just looking to, you know, talk some fishing with you guys. So to kick things off, I figure what we do today is we go ahead and talk about different types of line types, you know. And I know when I started first bass fishing, that was one common question that I had when you'd walk down the aisles of Bass Pro or Cabela's or Walmart, is they'd have aisles, sometimes more than one aisle, you know, dedicated really to fishing line. And when I first got into bass fishing, I'll tell you, you know, I was brand new at it. I mean, really, all I ever used was monofilament, and I'm not, and it's been around a long time. It's cheap, you know. That is some pros and cons about that. And but like I said, we're going to go ahead and talk about this, you know, to kick things off. And one term that I really want to get you guys familiar with when it comes to these different types of fishing lines is shock loading. And the reason why I say that is because let's just say that you're out fishing, and your hook, you know, whatever you're fishing, you know, your hook, your bobber, or your jig, or whatever you're fishing with, all of a sudden you get your thumps on there, and you set your hook, and immediately, and that's where I want to pause right there. The moment that you set your hook, there's a tension involved there, and it's a shock loading because you're lifting it up on your rod, you know, usually pretty sudden, and you, of course, the fish, depending on what type you get, you know, they're going to fight, and they're going to resist you and try to swim the other way. When that happens, you're basically taking two forces on this line, and you're pulling in opposite directions on this line. So immediately when you set the hook, there's a shock load involved. Now, the reason why I want to get you guys familiar with that is because, you know, when that happens, you know, of course, you know, another thing involved too is you have your different line ratings, you know, how many tests can the line handle. But I want to talk about the different characteristics of these lines. This is the reason why I want to talk about this. So this is monofilament line. You know, some pros and cons about it. Some pros would be, you know, it's real cheap. You know, I mean, I got this whole spool. I have like 700 yards of this. Got at Walmart, just some simple Zebco monofilament line. Got at Walmart, maybe spent like $4 bucks on it, you know, for an entire spool of it. So real cheap, very common line, been around forever, it seems like. And I'll tell you, I've fished with this for many years, and I've caught tons of fish on it. But another thing I want to bring up to you guys is when you're talking, you know, fishing line as well, the reason why there's different line types out there is your bait's going to react different, and your presentation is going to be different with them. So, for example, if I go up and I tie a lure on the end of this stuff is not very buoyant, but it is a little bit. So that's the thing, you know. So and it's also, especially when it comes to shock loading, there's a lot of line stretch in here. So, you know, sometimes you can get away with, you know, the line will stretch and it'll lose its elasticity after you set the hook and you start fighting the fish, and it'll be tensioned, and you know, it's good line. It really is. You know, it's been around for a long time. And well, anyway, the thing about this line is, just like I said, it has a lot of stretch, and it doesn't have a lot of buoyancy. You know, it doesn't float, but it doesn't necessarily sink very fast either. So, well, you know, that's something to think about when you're going and tying on lures with this is, you know, like, for example, a jig. You know, maybe you don't want your jig to sink as fast. I mean, now, granted, you know, line, it's not going to really, especially depending on what type of weight you have on a jig, it's not going to affect it that much, but it will affect, you know, your presentation a little bit, you know, because, especially with bass, we all know with bass, they're very picky eaters. You know, they want what they want, and they hunt in a certain way, and just like anything with the animals of nature, you know, they have their ways of hunting, and they have their place in the food chain. And so that's one thing to think about with monofilament line is it's cheap, available everywhere, and you know, it's going to sink a little bit slower with this. You know, it doesn't float, but you know, and it's got a lot of stretch to it. Now, one thing that I recently really got hooked on, you know, recently as far as line goes, is fluorocarbon. And the reason why I want to talk about fluorocarbon, and I'll be honest with you, I'm a little new to it as well, but you know, in fact, you know, where I'm going to demo here, I have some Cast King stuff, fluorocarbon stuff, and I have recently, you know, actually I got this for my graduation party here recently, and got this as a gift from one of my in-laws, and I love it. You know, I love the color of it, but the thing I love the most about it is it's very strong. It's got a lot of high strength to it, and of course too, and you can get monofilament in different colors as well, but and monofilament is a nylon material too, so it's basically like a plastic material. That's something to keep in mind. Now, fluorocarbon, hence the name, you know, it's definitely a little bit different of a process when they manufacture it, but they also have a carbon content into it to, you know, cause it to be more solid. And what in this stuff, the thing to keep in mind when you're tying on a lure is it sinks. it sinks and it's very strong. So I really like this stuff for jerk baits. You know, if I'm dragging crawls across the bottom, I really like it there too, because especially, you know, a lot of the places that I fish in the creeks are rocky, or they have some pretty a lot of cover is usually where I'm throwing this kind of line at. And you know, the thing about this that I really like, because it sinks, you know, I love it for jerk baits. You know, it's wonderful, especially the sinking ones, and I'm going to note that because now they have like floating ones. They've had them forever, really, but they have floating ones, they have topwater ones. But you know, the regular jerk baits that I like, you know, I like them to be either suspended or, you know, or sinking. And that's another thing I'll touch too as far as the monofilament goes. If you're fishing a suspended jerkbait, you know, tie on that mono. That'll be a perfect presentation and match. You know, since you have a suspended lure. Suspended means usually it's going to stay kind of about mid-range. So instead of just being on the bottom or diving or being on the top, it's going to be suspended in the middle. So that monofilament would be a good choice for that. Now for a sinking lure, yeah, definitely fluorocarbon all the way. But the thing, as far as shock loading goes with this stuff, when you set the hook, it's gonna, you know, first of all, you know, there's barely any stretch in this stuff, so that's the thing to keep in mind. But it's strong, so you know, like if you end up getting hung up on some cover or rocks, that's something to keep in mind. Is it's not going to break that easy, so you're not going to probably lose your lures as much. But you know, thing to keep in mind is you're going to have a kind of a worse time trying to get your lure out. But you know, there's different tactics for that as well. If you're creek fishing, you know, I just walk up to the lure and I get it out. You know, it's that simple. But if you're lake fishing, it might be a little bit of a different story. So just be prepared when you're getting this, and especially if you get a heavier fluorocarbon rating on this. That's something you want to keep in mind. So the last topic I want to talk about is actually braided line. Now, I really like this line because there's a lot of different, it's very versatile, but there's a lot of different uses for it. And I used to work for a company where we specialized in braid and carbon fiber braids. And the thing about braid, you know, just to give you a little background on it is, you know, like for example at the company, like, you know, like race cars, they have a lot of carbon fiber materials on them. Really what that starts off as is it's a braided material. It starts off as these carbon fibers, and what they do is they put it on a machine and they'll braid it up, usually with 3 or more or several fibers to get the braid. And then what they'll do is they'll pour resin on it to make it hard. And when it hardens, this is the thing that's really neat about braid is, especially when you're talking carbon fiber, is it'll share. Carbon fiber in particular, especially after they put that resin in and it hardens, it shares some of similar characteristics as metal. Like that's how strong it is, and it's a lot lighter. That's another thing to keep in mind as well. But in this case for fishing, you know, not trying to get too far off topic, basically what they do is they take maybe, I would say probably about 3 or more fibers, and what they're doing is they're braiding this stuff. And this is the end result. You get like a string, basically, is what it is, you know, if you really look at it. But the thing to think about is with shock loading, what this is going to do is it's going to pull the fibers tighter. And what they're going to do is, since they're all braided together, they're going to clench. You know, microscopically, they're going to clench, and giving it a lot more strength. So one thing, this is actually spider wire braid. It's 50-pound test. You know, I use this on my catfish pole. It's strong. You know, it's very strong. You know, and in fact, honestly, you're probably going to lose your lures before you break this. You know, depending on how heavy you go. Now, if you go with lighter braid, that's a different story. But thing to keep in mind, this stuff is very strong. I love it for catfishing, but as far as shock loading goes, there's not much play into this. You know, as far as shock loading, once you pull up, you know, it's very sensitive line. You know, especially like if you got a fish hitting it on the other line, it's very sensitive. And that's one thing I will say about fluorocarbon too, is because of how strong it is, and because it sinks and is more solid. You know, it's going to have more sensitivity, especially when you feel a fish, you know, giving it a thump or a thump, you know, and smallmouth, you know, that's kind of the way they hit on jigs too, is they're going to hit with like either a thump or it's going to be they're just going to slam it, you know, and it's very exciting to pull those in and stuff. But the thing to keep in mind with braid though is it floats. So like one thing especially with catfishing, you know, I mean, and it kind of doesn't really matter when you have a pole float on there and it's just slipping through. You got like slip bobbers and stuff like that. What it's going to do is usually when you cast out, one thing you're going to notice is this stuff is going to be sitting on top of the water. You know, so it's going to stay up there. But the thing I really like about this is string. I mean, the thing to think about it is these fibers. There's so many different colors out there that I mean, if I went over them all right now, I mean, I'd keep you guys on here all day long. You know, but there's a billion different types of there's a lot of availability for this stuff. You know, and I mean, I chose spider wire. I mean, really, you know, as far as brand goes, it's, you know, more preference. But you know, everybody has their go-to line. You know, like I recently got hooked on this Cast King stuff with fluorocarbon. Mono, I'm pretty open-minded when it comes to mono, but as far as braid goes, you know, a lot of availability for it. But the thing to think about too with braid also is this is really good for topwater, you know. So and in terms of presentation, you know, that's something to keep in mind. Like especially if you're fishing like really heavy cover, like lily pads or bats and stuff, and you just want to punch through, and you want some good strong line that isn't going to fray and that'll bust through with, you know, whatever, you know, like for a finesse rig. Like if you want to put like some type of drop shot rig that'll punch through that mat and go down, you know, or if you're flipping, you know, braid could be a choice to go to. Or sometimes, you know, fluorocarbon could work great for that stuff as well, especially for flipping. You know, it's really, a lot of people are real gung-ho on the finesse rigs with, you know, fluorocarbon. But in terms of braid, the stuff floats. Like if you're fishing frogs on those mats, or maybe, I actually, one time at Lake Cowan, I was bouncing a tube from pad to pad, and I had this braid stuff on, and it was with a tube bait. But I was just, you know, really just kind of bouncing it pad to pad, and I just wanted it to sink slow, and I actually did it with no weight, and I actually did very well. I got a few snaps at it, you know, by some largemouth, and so that's something to keep in mind. But as far as you know, that's the last topic that I kind of wanted to cover. So like I said, you know, super excited to kick off this YouTube channel. So like on YouTube, like, subscribe, comment, you know, and let's talk some fishing. So hope you guys have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you out in the water.